When you think of the slave trade, what is the first image that comes to your mind? Probably that of overcrowded slave ships crossing the Atlantic towards the Americas. This is the story we all learned. But what if I told you that's only half the story? What if the longest, oldest, and in many respects most cruel page of this tragedy was deliberately torn out of the books? There is a silent genocide that the world has chosen to forget. A story that lasted over 300 years, claimed millions of lives, and was justified in the name of God, but which today is covered by a pact of silence. We believe that no historical truth should remain hidden, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. This is the story of Africans who not only lost their freedom, but were systematically erased from existence, deprived even of the chance to leave descendants. The question no one asks is, why isn't there a large black diaspora in the Middle East today, as there is in the Americas? The answer is the key to one of humanity's best-kept secrets, and in this video, we are going to reveal it. If you have the courage to look at the past without filters and believe that stories like this need to be told, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because what we are about to show you will redefine your understanding of history. By liking and sharing this video, you're not just helping a channel, you're becoming part of a movement to rescue a memory that was stolen from millions. Tell us, from what city or country are you joining us on this journey for the truth? And comment below what other forgotten story you would like us to investigate. Get ready. The story you never heard is about to be told. Before the sails of Arab dhows cut across the blue waters of the Indian Ocean, and long camel caravans became dusty serpents in the Sahara, the African continent already knew servitude. However, to understand the magnitude of the tragedy that would unfold for more than 13 centuries, one must first strip away the modern, inflexible image of slavery. The word existed, as did the condition, but its meaning was immersed in a universe of social, spiritual, and cultural complexities that the outside world would come to shatter. In the vast landscapes of pre-Islamic Africa, slavery was rarely a perpetual sentence or a mark of absolute dehumanization. It was, in many cases, a consequence of war, a punishment for serious crimes, or a way to pay off debts. But the captive was not a mere soulless commodity. They were a person whose destiny had been altered, but who still possessed a place, albeit a subordinate one, within the community structure. In many societies, such as among the Ashanti or the Yoruba, the slave was often integrated into their master's household, becoming in practice a member of the extended family. They ate from the same pot, worked the same fields, and, in certain circumstances, could marry, own property, and even achieve positions of importance, such as warrior or farmer. The line separating the free from the enslaved was porous, capable of being crossed. The children of a slave did not necessarily inherit their parents' status. Freedom could be won by merit, a strategic marriage, or simply the benevolence of the master. The historian John Thornton, in his studies on Atlantic Africa, emphasizes that the ownership of people, more than the ownership of land, was the main measure of wealth and power. In this context, a slave was an asset too valuable to be discarded or treated with the systematic brutality that would characterize mass commerce. It was an investment in labor, prestige, and, at times, kinship ties. This form of servitude was deeply intertwined with local cosmology. Life was seen as a continuous cycle, and the community was not limited to the living, but included ancestors and those yet to be born. To break someone's lineage, to erase their descendants, was one of the gravest crimes imaginable. For this reason, the idea of systematic castration, which would become one of the most cruel marks of the Arab trade, was anathema, an act of violence so profound that it challenged the very order of the universe. Slavery, therefore, had ethical and spiritual limits imposed by tradition. A master who mistreated their servants excessively could incur the wrath of ancestors, or be ostracized by the community. There was an unwritten but strictly observed social pact that regulated power relations and guaranteed a minimum of dignity to the captive. It was a condition of misfortune, not of subhumanity. This reality, however, was about to be irrevocably corrupted by an external force, a new faith, and an insatiable economic demand that saw not men and women, but black gold to be exploited to exhaustion. If this initial complexity of African history already surprises you, know that we are only at the beginning of a journey that will reveal even more profound and disturbing truths. While in the Americas, the brutality of the transatlantic trade left an indelible and visible mark, a vibrant diaspora that, despite centuries of oppression, shaped the culture, music, and identity of the New World. In the Middle East and North Africa, the story was different. It was a story of a disappearance, of a demographic silence so deep and absolute that it amounts to a genocide. For more than 1,000 years, millions of Africans were captured, chained, and dragged across the Sahara and the Indian Ocean. However, today, walking through the streets of cities like Cairo, Damascus, or Baghdad, the inevitable question arises: where are their descendants? The answer lies in one of the most systematic and inhumane practices in the history of slavery: mass castration. This was not an isolated occurrence or a random act of cruelty. It was a deliberate policy, a meticulously organized industry that aimed to create a class of docile servants who, crucially, were incapable of reproducing. The demand for eunuchs in the Arab-Muslim world was vast and multifaceted. They were the perfect guardians for the harems of caliphs and sultans, figures who could circulate among the hundreds of wives and concubines without posing a threat to the purity of the royal bloodline. They were trusted administrators, bureaucrats, and advisors, because, without a family of their own, their loyalty was, in theory, entirely devoted to their master. They were also elite soldiers in certain armies, valued for their supposed ferocity and lack of earthly attachments. To feed this demand, castration centers were established at strategic points along the slave routes. In these places, African boys and young men, often less than 10 years old, were subjected to a brutal surgery, performed without anesthesia and in deplorable sanitary conditions. The procedure was terribly lethal. The Senegalese historian Tidiane Ndiaye points out that millions were subjected to these procedures, and researchers like Murray Gordon estimate that the mortality rate could exceed 70%. For every eunuch who arrived alive at the slave market in Istanbul or Muscat, many others had died in agony on the way. This practice represented a deliberate biological cut in the history of a people. Every castrated man was the end of a lineage, the final point of an ancestral heritage that extended back for generations. It was a calculated erasure, a way to ensure that enslaved Africans remained a transient presence, a disposable workforce that would not put down roots, would not form communities, and would not claim a place in society. The impact was devastating and permanent. While slavery in the Americas allowed for biological and cultural continuity, the Oriental trade created a demographic vacuum. The African heritage was systematically amputated. The silence that hangs over this history in international conferences and in the textbooks of the Arab world is the final echo of this genocide. It is the second death of the victims. First, the annihilation of their future, and then, the erasure of their memory. Understanding this policy of biological extermination is fundamental to understanding why one of the greatest crimes against humanity has remained, for so long, a forgotten footnote in the great and tragic narrative of history. For centuries, the Great Sahara Desert was more than a geographical barrier. It was a cultural and economic frontier. Sub-Saharan societies, with their complex structures of internal servitude, lived in relative isolation from the forces that were stirring in the north. But in the 11th century, the desert winds began to blow with a new and violent intensity. From the heart of what is now Mauritania and southern Morocco, a movement emerged that would forever change the destiny of millions of Africans: the Almoravids. They were a Berber people, ascetic warriors inflamed by a puritanical religious zeal, who saw the world through the lens of an expansionist faith and a ruthless ambition. Their arrival in the southern Sahara was not a simple incursion. It was a cataclysm, the inflection point that transformed slavery from a marginal social condition into a brutal, large-scale industry. The Almoravids were not interested in the nuances of African servitude, which, as we have seen, had limits and integrated the captive into the community. For them, the animist and polytheistic peoples of the south were kafirs, infidels whose subjugation was not only economically profitable, but morally justified by their interpretation of the faith. They introduced a logic of conquest and exploitation that was alien to most of the societies they encountered. The wars they waged were not aimed solely at the conquest of territories or the subjugation of rival kings. They were, fundamentally, razzias, expeditions of human hunting. The main objective was the massive capture of people to feed the expanding markets of North Africa and the Mediterranean. Gold, salt, and ivory, which had so long dominated the Trans-Saharan trade, were suddenly eclipsed by a new and terrible commodity: human life. This new dynamic radically altered power relations within Africa itself. Kingdoms that had once coexisted in a precarious balance were forced into a terrible choice: either become predators or become prey. To survive, many local leaders were coerced into participating in the trade, warring against their neighbors to capture slaves and trade them for horses, firearms, and other goods offered by merchants from the north. Historian Tidiane Ndiaye points out that this was the tragic moment when Africa began to devour itself, a vicious cycle of violence that destructured entire societies, broke ancient alliances, and sowed a distrust that would last for centuries. Slavery ceased to be a byproduct of war and became the very reason for war. The arrival of the Almoravids was the spark that ignited a devastating fire, industrializing the capture and sale of human beings and opening the commercial arteries through which the continent would be bled for nearly a millennium. The social and spiritual peace that, in a relative sense, governed many communities was shattered, and in its place arose an era of fear and predation on a continental scale. The history of the Arab-Muslim slave trade does not begin in the sub-Saharan savannas, but in the sands of Egypt and the Maghreb, a century after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. In the 7th century, driven by an overwhelming faith and a formidable military capacity, Arab armies swept through North Africa, a region that for centuries had been under the influence of Rome and Byzantium. In a series of lightning campaigns, they conquered Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, reaching the coasts of the Atlantic. This conquest was not just a change of political power. It was a civilizational transformation that reoriented the entire economic and cultural axis of the region, turning it away from the Christian Mediterranean and towards the heart of the nascent Islamic Empire, with its center in Damascus and, later, in Baghdad. With control firmly established over the North African coast, the eyes of the new conquerors turned south, beyond the intimidating vastness of the Sahara. The desert, once an almost impassable barrier, became a new ocean to be navigated. Legends spoke of kingdoms fabulously rich in gold, and the native Berbers of the desert, now converted to Islam and masters in the art of crossing the sands, became the perfect intermediaries for this new frontier of exploitation. The first significant and documented contact between the Arab-Muslim world and the sub-Saharan kingdoms was not at first a war of total conquest, but a series of incursions that tested the defenses and assessed the riches of the mysterious Bilad al-Sudan, the land of the blacks. It was in this context that one of the most crucial encounters in African history took place. In 641, the Arab general Amr ibn al-As, after conquering Egypt, sent an expedition south towards Nubia, an ancient Christian kingdom located in what is now Sudan. The first incursion was repelled by the fearsome Nubian archers, known to the Arabs as pupil strikers for their precise aim. However, the military pressure continued. The Caliphate's armies were persistent, and their presence on Nubia's northern border posed an existential threat. They were not just looking for gold or tribute. They were looking for something that would become the backbone of a new transcontinental economy: slaves. This first contact established a grim precedent: the military superiority and organizational cohesion of the Arab armies, combined with a religious justification for subjugating infidels, created a power imbalance that would be mercilessly exploited. The conquest of North Africa was not just the end of Roman Byzantine rule. It was the prologue to a new era, the opening of a gate to the south through which millions of lives would be drained from the African continent in the centuries that followed. After more than a decade of intermittent conflicts and fierce resistance from the Nubian archers, it became clear to both sides that a stalemate had been reached. The Caliphate's armies, under the command of the governor of Egypt, Abdallah ben Said, could not completely subdue the kingdom of Makuria, the most powerful of the Nubian states. In turn, the Nubian king Khalidarat knew that the military pressure on his northern border was unsustainable in the long run. In 652 AD, in an event that would mark a dark turning point in the history of Afro-Arab relations, the two sides met to negotiate an agreement. The result was an unprecedented treaty, known as the Pact, a word believed to derive from the Greek pakton, pact, or from Coptic, meaning exchange. This was not a common peace treaty. It was a long-term commercial contract that formalized the economic and human subjugation of a Christian kingdom to an Islamic empire. The central point of the Pact was shockingly simple. In exchange for a cessation of hostilities and recognition of its sovereignty, the Kingdom of Nubia committed to annually deliver hundreds of slaves to the Muslim governor of Egypt. Some sources cite the number of 360 slaves, a symbolic and continuous delivery, almost one a day. The treaty was incredibly detailed, specifying that the slaves should be of a middle age, neither children nor old people, and of both sexes. In return, the Muslims would provide Nubia with goods such as wheat, lentils, and textiles. The agreement also established rules for the passage of merchants and travelers, but its essence was the transformation of human beings into a regularized commodity, a fixed tribute paid by one state to another. For the first time in the region's history, slavery was institutionalized in an international diplomatic document. The impact of the Pact was profound and lasting. The treaty remained in force, with some interruptions and renegotiations for more than 600 years, becoming one of the longest agreements in recorded history. For Nubia, it created a perpetual obligation that distorted its social and military structure. The kingdom was forced to conduct its own slave-raiding expeditions into neighboring territories to the south and west, engaging in a cycle of violence to meet the annual quotas. For the Arab-Muslim world, the Pact was a model. It proved that it was possible to ensure a constant and predictable flow of African captives without the need for an expensive and permanent military conquest. The treaty legitimized the trade, transforming it from a byproduct of war into an administrative and bureaucratic practice. Historians like Tidiane and Di see this moment as the true birth of the Arab-Muslim slave trade on a systematic scale. The Pact of 652 was not just an agreement between two leaders. It was the signing of a sentence that would condemn millions of Africans to a future of captivity, establishing a legal and moral precedent for the largest trade in human beings in history. In any large-scale system of oppression, military force and economic greed are rarely enough to sustain it for centuries. A third, more insidious and powerful force is needed: moral and spiritual justification. In the case of the Arab-Muslim slave trade, this justification was found in specific interpretations of the sacred texts of Islam. Although Islam, at its advent, introduced reforms that regulated and, in certain aspects, humanized the existing practice of slavery in the Arabian Peninsula, encouraging the manumission of slaves as an act of piety, it did not abolish it. On the contrary, certain verses of the Quran were historically used to codify and legitimize the institution, providing a theological framework that allowed for its massive expansion. One of the most cited examples by historians such as Bernard Lewis and Murray Gordon is verse 50 of chapter 33, the Surah Al-Ahzab. In this passage, addressed to the Prophet Muhammad, the categories of women with whom marriage is lawful are listed, explicitly including those whom your right hand possesses from among those whom God has given you as booty. The expression, "what your right hand possesses," was universally interpreted in classical Islamic jurisprudence as a reference to female slaves, particularly those captured in war, the booty. Another relevant verse is found in chapter 4, Surah An-Nisa, verse 24, which prohibits marriage to women who are already married, except for the captives whom your right hand possesses. Such passages were the basis for the legalization of concubinage with enslaved women, a practice that became ubiquitous throughout the Islamic world. This textual legitimation had profound consequences. It removed slavery from the secular sphere and inserted it into the sacred domain, making it a practice sanctioned by God. This created a moral paradox, a faith that preached mercy and the equality of all believers before Allah, simultaneously justified a system of brutal exploitation. To resolve this dissonance, a disturbing logic was developed. It was believed that slavery was a vehicle for salvation. To capture an infidel and bring them to a Muslim land, even as a slave, was seen as an opportunity to expose them to the true faith, offering them the chance to convert and save their eternal soul. In this worldview, slavery was almost an act of charity, a mercy that exchanged earthly freedom for spiritual salvation. This potent combination of economic interest and religious sanction, as Murray Gordon points out, made the slave trade not only acceptable, but defensible for centuries. The Word of God, interpreted by men of power, was transformed into chains, and faith into a justification for the subjugation of millions. Long before the first European slave ships sailed for the Atlantic, a vast and complex network of slave routes was already bleeding the African continent. The Arab-Muslim trade operated on two main fronts, two gigantic arteries of human suffering that stretched for thousands of miles across unforgiving terrain: the Trans-Saharan routes and the Indian Ocean maritime routes. These were not simple trade routes. They were corridors of death, where human life was the cheapest commodity and agony, the constant companion of travel. The Trans-Saharan route was the oldest, and in many respects the most brutal. Starting from commercial centers in the interior of West Africa, such as Timbuktu and Gao, the caravans gathered hundreds, sometimes thousands of captives. Chained to one another in long lines, with heavy wooden yokes on their necks, they were forced to march north, across the world's largest hot desert. The journey was a test of almost superhuman endurance. Under a scorching sun during the day and a biting cold at night, the prisoners faced hunger, excruciating thirst, and complete exhaustion. The slave traders, usually Arabs or Tuareg Berbers, were merciless. Anyone who faltered, fell ill, or tried to escape was executed on the spot, their body left behind as a warning to the others and a feast for the vultures. The historian Tidiane Ndiaye states that the mortality on these caravans was astonishing, with estimates suggesting that for every slave who arrived alive at the markets of Morocco, Algeria, or Egypt, at least one other had perished on the way. The sands of the Sahara became a vast anonymous cemetery for millions of Africans. In parallel, on the east coast of Africa, an equally cruel network unfolded in the waters of the Indian Ocean. Arab merchants, mainly from Oman, established trading posts along the Swahili coast, in cities like Mombasa and Kilwa, with their epicenter on the island of Zanzibar. From these ports, they launched raiding expeditions into the continent's interior, devastating regions that today include Tanzania, Mozambique, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The captives were then piled onto dhows, the traditional Arab sailboats, and transported in conditions as terrible as, or even more so than, those of the transatlantic slave ships. Their destination was the Arabian Peninsula, the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and even India. These maritime and land routes did not just transport people. They destructured civilizations, fueled endless wars, and created an economy based on human predation that flourished for over 1,000 years, leaving a legacy of devastation and forgetfulness. The name Zanzibar evokes images of white sand beaches, turquoise waters, and the intoxicating aroma of spices like cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. It is the image of a tropical paradise, a dream destination for travelers from all over the world. But behind this idyllic facade, the island hides a terribly dark past, a secret kept in its narrow alleys and its stone dungeons. In the 19th century, under the rule of the Sultanate of Oman, Zanzibar was transformed into the epicenter of the East African slave trade, becoming one of the largest and most notorious human markets the world has ever seen. In 1832, Sultan Sayyid Said of Oman made a strategic decision that would seal the island's fate. He transferred his capital from Muscat, on the Arabian Peninsula, to Zanzibar. From there, he and his successors ruled a vast coastal commercial empire, whose main source of wealth was not spices, but the capture and sale of Africans from the continent. The island became a gigantic depot. Shipments of men, women, and children, captured in brutal expeditions that reached as far as the African Great Lakes, were disembarked daily at its ports. European explorers who visited the island at the time such as David Livingstone and Richard Burton, left shocking accounts of what they witnessed. Burton described the slave market in Stone Town as a scene of absolute horror, where captives were inspected like cattle. They were forced to walk, run, have their teeth examined, and their bodies groped by potential buyers, while the auctioneer's whip cracked in the air. The conditions in which the slaves were kept before the sale were indescribable. They were locked in dark, unventilated underground chambers with minimal space, little food, and no hygiene. Many died of diseases like dysentery or from sheer despair before they were even sold. The old Anglican cathedral in Stone Town was symbolically built on the exact site of the former slave market, and in its basement, it is still possible today to visit two of these dungeons, a claustrophobic and chilling testimony to the suffering that occurred there. From Zanzibar, slaves were sent throughout the Middle East and Asia. Women were destined for the harems of Istanbul and Cairo, while men and boys were sold to work in the date plantations of Iraq, the clove plantations of Zanzibar and Pemba themselves, or, after castration, to serve as eunuchs in the courts of Arabia and Persia. The paradisiacal Spice Island was, in reality, built on bones and watered with tears. Its prosperity was fueled by the commodification of human life, and its idyllic beaches were the last sight of Africa for hundreds of thousands of captives who embarked on a journey of no return. Unlike the transatlantic trade, which prioritized the capture of strong men for exhausting manual labor on American plantations, the Arab-Muslim trade was driven by a demand with distinct and, in many aspects, more complex characteristics. The human commodity was not homogeneous. There was a careful selection based on age, gender, and physical characteristics, shaped by the specific needs of the Islamic society of the time. This selective demand defined the profile of the victims and the distinct natures of the suffering they were subjected to. Two categories in particular were the most coveted: young women and prepubescent boys. The demand for women, especially young ones considered beautiful, was insatiable. They were destined to become concubines in the harems of caliphs, sultans, and other rich and powerful men, a symbol of status and opulence. The harem, often romanticized in Western culture as a place of luxury and pleasure, was in reality a gilded cage, a system of institutionalized sexual exploitation. The captured women were ripped from their families, cultures, and identities, forced to sexually serve their masters and live in an environment of intense rivalry and control. In addition to sexual service, they were also employed as domestic servants, cooks, musicians, and dancers. The offspring of a master with his enslaved concubine, according to Islamic law, were born free, which created a constant need for replenishment of women in the harems, fueling a perpetual cycle of capture and importation. Women from Ethiopia, known for their beauty, were particularly valued and fetched high prices in the markets of Cairo and Baghdad. On the other hand, the demand for men was equally specific. Although many were used for heavy labor in salt mines, date plantations, or as soldiers, the Mamelukes of Egypt are a famous example, one of the cruelest and most lucrative demands was for eunuchs. Young boys captured before puberty were the preferred targets for castration, a brutal procedure that we have already detailed. Those who survived were destined for a life of service in roles that required trust and sexual neutrality. They were the guardians of the harems, palace administrators, tutors to royal children, and high government officials. Their inability to produce descendants made them, in their master's view, ideal servants, without dynastic ambitions and with unshakable loyalty. This demand profile, focused on sexual exploitation and mutilation to create a class of specialized servants, reveals a particularly dark facet of the Oriental trade. It was not just about exploiting a person's labor, but about controlling and reshaping their very biology and identity to suit the whims of a slave-owning society. In the annals of history, few slave rebellions reached the scale, duration, and impact of the Zanj rebellion. For almost 15 years in the heart of the powerful Abbasid Caliphate, the most sophisticated and militarily advanced empire of its time, an army of men and women ripped from East Africa not only rose up against their oppressors, but built their own state, defying and humiliating the forces of Baghdad. This is the story of a Black Spartacus on an even larger scale, an epic of resistance that was deliberately swept from official records, but whose cry for freedom still echoes through the centuries. The protagonists were the Zanj, an Arabic term used to refer to the black peoples of the Swahili coast. Tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of them, were captured and transported to the south of modern-day Iraq for a monumental and hellish task, draining the salty swamps of the Basra region to transform them into agricultural lands. The work was inhumane. Standing in the brackish water under a scorching sun, they scraped away the top layer of saline soil, facing malaria, malnutrition, and the constant brutality of their overseers. They were an anonymous mass of disposable workers, politically and socially invisible. Everything changed in 869 AD with the arrival of a charismatic and enigmatic man, Ali ibn Muhammad, a Persian who claimed descent from the Prophet. Ali saw in the Zanj the spark of revolution. He went to the swamps not as a master but as a liberator. With a powerful rhetoric that mixed social justice and religious fervor, he promised them not only freedom but also wealth and power. "I have come to free you," he declared, and the enslaved, united by suffering and hope, followed him en masse. What began as a rebellion quickly transformed into total war. The Zanj, using their work tools as weapons, ambushed and defeated the first militias sent to crush them. They were formidable warriors, knowledgeable of the swampy terrain that became their fortress. Organized under Ali's command, they built an army, conquered important cities like Basra, and founded their own capital, the fortress city of Al-Muqtara, the Chosen One. For more than a decade, they controlled a vast portion of southern Iraq, interrupting vital trade routes and threatening Baghdad itself. The Zanj rebellion was so successful that it shook the foundations of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Caliph was forced to divert entire armies from other fronts to contain the rebel tide, sending his own brother, al-Muwaffaq, to lead a campaign of annihilation. Their story proves that, even in the most oppressive conditions, the human spirit refuses to be extinguished. They were not passive victims. They were agents of their own history, warriors who forged a nation from despair. If a story of resistance as powerful as that of the Zanj, who challenged an empire for 14 years, was practically erased from the books, imagine how many other truths are still hidden. If you believe that knowledge is the greatest tool of freedom, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Help us bring more stories like this to light. Like this video so it can reach more people, and comment below what city or country you are watching us from. We want to know how far this message of resistance is reaching. And if there's a forgotten story you'd like to see told here, suggest it in the comments. Together, we can rescue the past to understand the present. The lasting success of the Zanj rebellion represented an unbearable humiliation for the Abbasid Caliphate. For more than a decade, an army composed of former slaves not only resisted but prospered, inflicting consecutive defeats on the proud imperial troops. The existence of the Zanj state in southern Iraq was an open wound, a direct affront to the caliph's authority and the social order that sustained the empire. In 879 AD, Baghdad's patience ran out. The caliphate's regent, al-Muwaffaq, the brother of Caliph al-Mu'tamid, decided to personally take command of the war. He would spare no resources, men, or brutality to extinguish the rebellion once and for all. What followed was one of the most massive and relentless military campaigns of the era. Al-Muwaffaq mobilized tens of thousands of soldiers, equipped a vast river fleet to navigate the swamps, and began a slow and methodical siege of the rebel capital, Al-Muqtara. The strategy was scorched earth. The Abbasid forces built their own fortified cities around the Zanj capital, systematically cutting off their supply lines. Fierce battles were fought for every canal and every inch of land. The Zanj, though outnumbered and with fewer resources, fought with the courage of desperation. They knew that defeat meant not only the end of their freedom, but total annihilation. The war of attrition dragged on for years, but the weight of imperial power was overwhelming. In August 883 AD, after a prolonged and bloody siege, al-Muwaffaq's forces finally broke through al-Muqtara's defenses. The repression that followed was devastating, a calculated act of vengeance to erase not only the rebellion, but the very memory of it. Thousands of Zanj fighters were killed in the final battle. Ali ibn Muhammad, the charismatic leader of the revolt, was captured and beheaded, his head taken in triumph to Baghdad. The city of al-Mukhtarah was completely razed, its walls torn down and its buildings burned, so that nothing would remain of the state that dared to challenge the caliphate. But the physical violence was only the beginning of the erasure. In the years and centuries that followed, the empire's official historians worked to minimize or demonize the revolt. They portrayed Ali ibn Muhammad as a heretic and an impostor, and the Zanj as wild bandits, stripped of any political or social legitimacy. The event, which represented the greatest internal threat the Abbasid Caliphate had ever faced, was systematically marginalized in historical records. This was not an accidental forgetting. It was a deliberate policy of silencing. To recognize the magnitude and sophistication of the Zanj rebellion would be to admit the profound injustice of the slave system and the capacity of Africans to resist epically, an admission that would destabilize the narrative of a harmonious and just Islamic civilization. The result is that one of the greatest uprisings for freedom in human history remains largely unknown to this day, a victim not only of the sword, but also of the pen of the victors. The institutionalization of slavery in the Arab-Muslim world was not an anonymous process, conducted only by greedy merchants on the empire's fringes. On the contrary, the practice was embraced, normalized, and even celebrated at the highest echelons of political and religious power. Great caliphs, sultans, emirs, and religious scholars not only owned slaves but did so on a monumental scale, seeing the practice as a divinely sanctioned rite and an indispensable symbol of power and prestige. The acceptance of slavery by the ruling elite was crucial for its longevity and expansion, transforming it into a pillar of the social and economic structure of the Islamic world for more than a millennium. Perhaps no illustrious figure better illustrates this reality than Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who ruled the Abbasid Empire from 786 to 809 AD. Immortalized in popular culture as the central character of many stories from The 1001 Nights, Harun al-Rashid is often portrayed as a wise, just, and magnanimous ruler who disguised himself to walk the streets of Baghdad and learn the concerns of his people. His court was a center of cultural and scientific splendor, marking the peak of the Islamic Golden Age. However, this romanticized image hides a much darker reality. The palace of Harun al-Rashid and those of his successors teemed with thousands of slaves. His harem was legendary, supposedly housing more than 1,000 concubines, most of them captured in various parts of the world, including Africa. In addition to them, an army of eunuchs managed the private quarters, and countless other servants, from cooks to guards, attended to every whim of the court. The ownership of slaves by Harun al-Rashid was not seen as a moral failing or a contradiction to his piety. It was, on the contrary, an expression of his sovereignty and wealth, perfectly aligned with the legal and religious norms of the time. He, like other influential Muslim leaders, never seriously questioned the morality of the practice. Islamic law, Sharia, as interpreted by the court's jurists, regulated slavery but did not prohibit it. It established rules on the purchase, sale, and treatment of slaves, treating them essentially as property. The irony is stark. The same empire that produced remarkable advances in mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, and that preached a message of religious compassion, was built on the backs of millions of enslaved human beings. The example set by leaders like Harun al-Rashid had a ripple effect throughout society. If the commander of the faithful, the spiritual and temporal leader of the Muslim world, maintained huge contingents of slaves without any crisis of conscience, it became unthinkable for the common citizen to question the legitimacy of the system. Slavery was thus woven into the very tapestry of daily, social, and political life, sanctioned by God and exemplified by the Caliph. There are places in the world where history does not seem to pass. It repeats itself in cycles of violence and suffering, like a wound that never heals. Darfur, a vast arid region in western Sudan, is one of those places. For the outside world, the name Darfur became synonymous with genocide in the early 21st century, a brutal conflict that shocked the global conscience, albeit briefly. But what most people don't know is that this modern tragedy was not an isolated event. It was, in fact, the most recent eruption of a history of ethnic violence and enslavement that has plagued the region for more than 300 years, since the first contacts between Arab conquerors and local African kingdoms. Darfur's history as a reservoir of slaves for the Arab Muslim world is directly linked to that seminal agreement we have already discussed, the Bach Treaty of 652. Although the treaty was signed with Nubia, to the east of Darfur, it established a precedent and created a demand that pushed slave-raiding expeditions further and further west, to the lands of peoples who were not protected by a strong, centralized state. Darfur, the land of the fur, became a privileged hunting ground. For centuries, Arab slave traders, known as Jalaba, penetrated the region, establishing networks that funneled a constant flow of captives north to Egypt and beyond. The very rise of the Sultanate of Darfur from the 17th century was funded and sustained by the slave trade. The fur sultans, although themselves black Africans, adopted Arabic as their official language and Islam as their state religion, and actively participated in razzias against neighboring populations, whom they considered pagan and therefore subject to enslavement. This long and complex history of interaction between Arabized groups and non-Arabized African populations created a society deeply divided along ethnic and racial lines. A social hierarchy developed, with those who claimed Arab ancestry at the top and the pure African groups at the bottom. This historical fissure is the key to understanding the 21st century genocide. The conflict that erupted in 2003 was not just a dispute over land or political power. It was the reactivation of an ancient predator-prey dynamic. The Sudanese government in Khartoum, dominated by an elite that identifies as Arab, armed and financed local Arab herding militias known as Janjaweed, to crush a rebellion by African groups like the Fur, Masalit, and Zagawa. The term Janjaweed is itself revealing, often translated as demon on horseback. The rhetoric used by the militias was explicitly racist, referring to their victims as Zurug, a derogatory term for blacks, and Abid, slaves. The villages were not just attacked, they were systematically destroyed in a campaign of ethnic cleansing that aimed to erase the African presence from the land. The genocide in Darfur, with its millions of displaced and hundreds of thousands dead, was not therefore a modern aberration, but the tragic climax of a legacy of enslavement and racism that began more than a millennium ago, on that same unstable border between North and South. When news of the Darfur genocide began to spread around the world in the early 2000s, the international media narrative often simplified the conflict as a tribal war over scarce resources such as water and land. While these factors played a role, this superficial analysis ignored the deeper and darker dimension of the conflict, its direct roots in the history of the slave trade and the ideology of Arab racial supremacy that sustained it. The main perpetrators of the violence, the Janjaweed militias, were not just bandits or tribal fighters. They were the modern embodiment of the ancient slave hunters who terrorized the region for centuries. The name Janjaweed itself carries the weight of this history. It is an amalgamation of words that mean, in local dialect, a man or demon armed on horseback with a G3 rifle. The image of the man on horseback is crucial. Historically, the horse was the military platform from which Arab slave traders launched their razzias against African farming villages. The horse represented power, mobility, and terror. The 21st century Janjaweed recreated this image with modern lethality, trading swords for Kalashnikov rifles and grenade launchers, but maintaining the same tactic of rapid and brutal attacks on horseback and camels, supported by vehicles and the Sudanese government's air force. They were, in essence, the direct heirs of the Jalaba, the ancient slave traders. The connection, however, goes far beyond tactics. It lies in the ideology. Accounts from survivors collected by organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International reveal a consistent pattern of racist verbal abuse during the attacks. The Janjaweed militiamen shouted insults like Abid, slaves, and Zurug, blacks, at their victims, while they plundered, raped, and killed. Their mission, openly declared, was to cleanse the land, to expel the African populations to make way for the Arab tribes. This language of dehumanization is the same that was used for centuries to justify enslavement. By labeling the Fur, Masalit, and Zagawa peoples as slaves, the Janjaweed denied their humanity and their right to land, property, and life itself. Mass rape, used as a systematic weapon of war, also had a specific genocidal purpose: to impregnate African women to dilute and Arabize their lineage, an act of biological domination that echoes the practices of the harem. The indifference of the international community, and particularly of many Arab countries, to this ethnic cleansing can also be seen through this historical lens. What was happening in Darfur was seen by some not as a genocide, but as the continuation of a natural social order, where Arab groups dominate the Africans. The tragedy of Darfur is, therefore, a terrible example of how the unresolved legacy of slavery can erupt in the present with devastating violence, showing that the racist ideologies created to justify the trade in human beings have not disappeared. They have only lain dormant, waiting for a political spark to reignite. When one thinks of the slave trade, the dominant image is that of the transatlantic trade: overcrowded ships crossing the Atlantic, auctions in America, and brutal labor on sugar and cotton plantations. This narrative, while absolutely crucial, is incomplete. It overshadows the existence of an older, more enduring, and, in fundamental aspects, operationally distinct trade: the Arab-Muslim trade. Comparing the two systems is not an exercise to diminish the horror of one at the expense of the other, but rather to understand the different logics of exploitation that operated and how they produced such drastically different legacies for African populations and their descendants. The first major difference lies in duration and scale. The transatlantic trade lasted approximately 4 centuries, from the 16th to the 19th century. The Arab-Muslim trade, in turn, began in the 7th century and continued in some regions until the 20th century, lasting more than 13 centuries. Although the exact numbers are a subject of intense academic debate due to a lack of precise records, historians such as Tidiane Ndiaye and Paul Lovejoy suggest that the number of victims in both trades was in the tens of millions. Ndiaye, for example, posits that the Arab trade may have claimed an even greater number of lives, especially when considering the extremely high mortality rate during capture and transport. The second fundamental difference is in the victim's profile and the purpose of slavery. The Atlantic trade was overwhelmingly a labor enterprise. Its logic was economic and agrarian. The demand was for men, in a proportion of about 2 men for every woman, to provide the muscle power needed for the plantation economies of the New World. The Oriental trade, as we have seen, had a more diverse demand. In addition to labor for agriculture, as in date plantations and mining, there was an immense demand for women for sexual and domestic purposes in harems, and for boys to be castrated and serve as eunuchs. This resulted in a much more balanced gender proportion, or on some routes, even a majority of women and children. The third and perhaps most impactful difference is in the treatment of descendants and the demographic legacy. In the transatlantic system, the reproduction of slaves was, in many cases, encouraged. The children of a female slave, under the law partus sequitur ventrem, inherited their mother's status, becoming the property of the master. This created a self-sustaining slave population, and after abolition, gave rise to vast and visible Afro-descendant communities in the Americas. In the Arab-Muslim world, the dynamic was the opposite. The widespread practice of castrating men prevented the formation of families. Furthermore, the children of a free man with his enslaved concubine were born free and were often assimilated into the father's family. These two factors combined, the reproductive annihilation of many men and the assimilation of the children of enslaved women, resulted in what Ndiaye calls genocide by erasure, a near-complete demographic disappearance that explains the absence of a visible black diaspora in the Middle East today. One of the most intriguing and revealing questions when comparing the two great slave trades is their radically different demographic result. In the Americas, from Brazil to the United States, from Colombia to Cuba, the African heritage is a living and pulsating force. The culture, music, cuisine, religion, and the very genetic composition of the nations were indelibly shaped by the presence of millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants. It is a visible diaspora, a presence that, despite all the racism and oppression, refuses to be ignored. In stark contrast, the Arab Muslim world, which imported Africans for a period 3 times longer, presents a picture of almost invisibility. Where are the vast Afro-Iranian, Afro-Turkish, or Afro-Saudi communities? The answer to this question exposes the deepest and cruelest gears of the Oriental slave system. The main reason for this erased diaspora was the policy of reproductive annihilation through castration. As detailed earlier, the eunuch industry was a central feature of the Oriental trade. Millions of African men and boys were systematically mutilated, an act that not only robbed them of the ability to have children, but also abruptly ended their family lineages forever. Each eunuch represented a genetic and cultural dead end. This mass biological extermination ensured that a large percentage of the African men who arrived in the Middle East left no descendants, preventing the formation of a sustainable population nucleus. The second factor was the assimilation pattern through the harem system. Islamic law stipulated that the children of a free Muslim man with his enslaved concubine were born free and were legally recognized as his heirs. Unlike the rigid one-drop rules that evolved in the Americas, where any trace of African ancestry made a person black, Middle Eastern society had a more fluid racial classification system. The children of mixed unions were often assimilated into their father's culture and ethnicity. Over a few generations, through continuous marriage into the local population, African physical traits could be diluted, and the memory of slave ancestry was often forgotten or deliberately suppressed as it carried a social stigma. Finally, mortality rates in the Oriental trade, both during transport, especially Trans-Saharan, and in the castration procedure itself, were prohibitively high. It is possible that, proportionally, fewer people survived the journey and its immediate consequences compared to the Atlantic trade, as horrible as the latter was. The combination of these 3 factors, reproductive annihilation by castration, cultural erasure by assimilation, and extreme mortality rates, created a demographic vacuum. The African diaspora in the Middle East and North Africa is not invisible because it was small. It is invisible because it was systematically prevented from existing. The demographic silence that is perceived today is the most eloquent testimony to the success of a slow and deliberate genocide, a crime whose final result was not exploitation, but disappearance. To understand the scale and brutality of the transatlantic trade, it is essential to understand the economic machine that drove it, the triangular trade. This was not a simple bilateral trade between Africa and the Americas, but a complex and highly profitable system that interconnected 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, in a vicious cycle of production and exploitation. This economic engine, perfectly lubricated by greed, was the driving force behind the forced transport of more than 12 million Africans and the transformation of the Americas into a motor of wealth for Europe. The first leg of the journey began in European ports, such as Liverpool, Nantes, or Lisbon. Ships departed loaded with manufactured goods, products of a Europe in full industrial and mercantile ascent. These goods included textiles, firearms, gunpowder, rum, metal utensils, and trinkets. The value of these products was relatively low in Europe, but they were extremely coveted on the African coast, where they became currency for the most valuable commodity of all, human beings. The second leg, known as the Middle Passage, was the most infamous. Upon arriving at the coast of Africa, at the trading posts and forts established by European powers, the ship captains negotiated with local African kings and merchants. They traded their goods for men, women, and children who had been captured in wars or kidnapped in the interior of the continent. Once the ship's holds were filled to their maximum capacity, and often beyond it, the terrifying journey across the Atlantic began. The Africans were chained in tiny, dark, unventilated spaces, in non-existent hygienic conditions, where diseases like dysentery and scurvy spread rapidly. Violence, malnutrition, and despair were constant, and the mortality rate could reach 20% or more during the crossing. The third and final leg of the triangle took place in the Americas. The surviving Africans were sold at auctions in ports like Salvador, Cartagena, or Charleston. The profit from the sale was then used to buy the products of the colonies, cultivated and extracted by slave labor: sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, and precious metals. The ships now loaded with these raw materials returned to Europe. There, the products were processed, sold with huge profit margins, and further fueled the Industrial Revolution, generating the capital needed to finance the next trip of the cycle. The historian Eric Williams, in his classic work Capitalism and Slavery, argued forcefully that it was the wealth generated by this triangular system that financed the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. The triangular trade was, therefore, more than a trade system. It was the engine of a new global economy, a relentless machine built on the dehumanization of a continent and the exploitation of millions, whose gears ground up human lives to produce the capital that shaped the modern world. No account of the transatlantic trade can capture the totality of the horror of the Middle Passage, the sea crossing between Africa and the Americas. It was more than a journey. It was a plunge into a floating hell, an experience of dehumanization so extreme that it defies comprehension. For the millions of Africans who were forced to board the slave ships, the Middle Passage represented the final rupture with their homeland, their families, and their very identity, and the beginning of a nightmare from which many would not wake up. The ship's logbooks, the accounts of crew members, and the testimonies of a few survivors paint a picture of indescribable suffering. The ordeal began at the moment of boarding. The captives were branded with a hot iron, like cattle, to identify which company they belonged to. Then they were taken to the holds, dark, low, and unventilated spaces, where they would be confined for weeks or months. Men were generally chained to one another by the ankles, in pairs, with so little space that they could not stand up or even sit upright. They were forced to lie on their sides, on wooden platforms, squeezed into an arrangement known as tight pack, which aimed to maximize the number of pieces on board, even if that meant a higher mortality rate. The air was unbreathable, a foul mixture of sweat, vomit, urine, feces, and the smell of death. The heat was unbearable, and the constant rocking of the ship caused nausea and painful abrasions on their naked bodies against the rough wood. Diseases spread like wildfire. Dysentery, known as the bloody flux, was the main cause of death, transforming the holds into a sea of human waste and contamination. Outbreaks of smallpox, measles, and scurvy were also common. Food was scarce and of poor quality, usually a porridge of beans or corn, and water was rationed and often contaminated. The crew's violence was a constant. The sailors themselves, often brutalized by the conditions, used the whip to enforce discipline and crush any sign of resistance. The women, generally kept in a separate compartment and with fewer restrictions, were constantly vulnerable to rape and sexual abuse by the crew. To prevent wasting away and muscle atrophy, the captives were periodically forced onto the deck to dance under the threat of the whip. Many, overcome by despair, took this opportunity to jump into the sea, choosing death in the Atlantic waters instead of the slavery that awaited them. The bodies of those who died on board were simply thrown overboard, an occurrence so common that it was said that sharks followed the route of the slave ships. John Newton, a former slave ship captain who later became an abolitionist and wrote the famous hymn, Amazing Grace, described these scenes in his diaries, exposing the brutality of a system he himself had helped perpetuate. The Middle Passage was not just a commercial route, it was a holocaust at sea, a testament to the human capacity for cruelty and the unimaginable resilience of those who, against all odds, survived it. The narrative of slavery often portrays Africans as passive victims, unable to resist the overwhelming tide of European exploitation. However, history is full of examples of African leaders who fought fiercely against the trade, using not only the force of arms, but also the astuteness of diplomacy. One of the most emblematic and tragic cases of diplomatic resistance is that of King Nzinga Mbemba of the Congo, who, after his conversion to Christianity, adopted the name of Afonso I. His desperate letters to the King of Portugal in the early 16th century are a moving testimony to a leader's struggle to save his people from the disintegration caused by the insatiable greed of the slave traders. Afonso, ascended the throne of the Kingdom of Congo in 1509. He was a devout Christian who saw Portugal not as an enemy, but as a brother in faith, a partner in modernizing his kingdom. He welcomed missionaries, sent his children to study in Europe, and actively sought to import Portuguese technology and knowledge, such as architecture and literacy. In return, he established commercial relations, which initially were based on ivory and copper. However, Portuguese merchants quickly discovered that the trade in human beings was infinitely more profitable. The demand for labor for the Portuguese sugar plantations on the neighboring island of São Tomé exploded, and traders began to operate in his kingdom with increasing audacity. What began as a controlled trade in prisoners of war soon spiraled out of control. Portuguese merchants, in collusion with some corrupt Congolese nobles, began to kidnap people throughout the kingdom, including members of noble families, and even relatives of the king himself. Congolese society began to disintegrate. Law and order were replaced by fear and predation. Seeing his kingdom being depopulated and corrupted, Afonso III began a vigorous correspondence with his royal brother, King John III of Portugal. In a letter dated 1526, his anguish is palpable. He writes, "Sire, your highness should not ignore that the desire for goods and things from your kingdom is so great among our subjects that many of them, forgetting God and us, imprison their own relatives to sell them." He implores the Portuguese king to send only priests and teachers, and not goods, except for wine and flour for the Holy Sacrament. He states categorically, "It is our will that in this kingdom there be no trade in slaves or an outlet for them." Historians like Linda Haywood, who studied these documents, see in them a desperate attempt by a ruler to use diplomatic channels and the language of shared Christian morality to stop a catastrophe. Portugal's responses were evasive and contemptuous. The profit from the trade was simply too great to be abandoned for moral appeals. The tragedy of Afonso I is the tragedy of a man who believed in the promise of a civilized partnership, only to discover that, for his supposed European brothers, the souls and bodies of his people were just another commodity on the scale of global trade. While leaders like Afonso IV of the Congo tried to use diplomacy to protect their people, many other African kingdoms and leaders understood that the only response to the violence of the slave hunters was the violence of armed resistance. Over centuries, in different parts of the continent, centers of fierce military opposition arose, both against Arab and European incursions. These episodes of armed resistance are crucial to dismantling the myth of African passivity and recognizing the agency and courage of the peoples who fought to defend their freedom. Long before the height of the Atlantic trade, great empires of West Africa had already established powerful military structures that allowed them to resist incursions from the north. The Mali Empire, founded by the legendary Sundiata Keita in the 13th century, is a notable example. Although Mali was an Islamic empire, it maintained firm control over its territory and trade routes, defending itself against nomadic groups and traders who came from the Sahara. The UNESCO work, General History of Africa, highlights that the strength of centralized states like Mali lay in their ability to organize standing armies and control the economy, which gave them the means to contain external threats and regulate trade on their own terms. The very Epic of Sundiata, one of the most important pieces of West African oral tradition, is a celebration of resistance against tyranny and the construction of a strong and unified state, capable of guaranteeing the security of its people. Centuries later, with the intensification of both trades, armed resistance became even more vital and desperate. In the late 19th century, when the scramble for Africa by European powers was in full swing, and Arab traders still operated with impunity in vast regions of Central Africa, figures like Rabi az-Zubair emerged. Rabi was not a king of ancient lineage, but a Sudanese warlord who built an ephemeral but powerful empire in the Lake Chad Basin. He was himself a complex figure who at times participated in the trade, but who also came into direct conflict with Arab caravans and, later, with the French colonial powers that were trying to dominate the region. Colonial records and local oral traditions show that Rabi led a significant military resistance, using guerrilla tactics and a well-disciplined army to challenge both the Arab traders and the European colonizers. His struggle demonstrates that, even in the face of the technological superiority of his enemies and the disintegration of traditional political structures, the will to resist remained strong. From medieval empires to 19th-century warlords, African history is full of examples of men and women who took up arms to fight against the dehumanization of slavery, a heroic chapter that deserves to be told with the same emphasis as the stories of victimization. Resistance to slavery was not limited to the battlefield or royal courts. For the millions of Africans who survived the Middle Passage and were forced to work in the Americas, resistance was a daily act, woven into the very fabric of their lives. One of the most powerful and enduring forms of resistance was escape and the creation of autonomous communities, hidden in the depths of the forests, mountains, and swamps of the New World. Known as quilombos in Brazil, palenques in Spanish America, or maroon communities in Jamaica and Suriname, these societies represented a radical negation of slavery. They were beacons of freedom, spaces where Africans and their descendants could rebuild their lives, preserve their cultures, and actively fight against the system that tried to crush them. The Quilombo dos Palmares in colonial Brazil is perhaps the most famous and grandiose example of this form of resistance. For almost a century, from 1605 to 1694, Palmares flourished in the hills of the Serra da Barriga, in the current state of Alagoas. It was a confederation of interconnected settlements, housing a population that, at its peak, may have reached 20,000 people. Palmares was not a simple fugitive camp. It was an African state recreated in the Americas. It had a complex political structure, led by an elected king, with Zumbi dos Palmares being the most famous. It developed diversified agriculture, formidable defense systems, and a rich cultural life that mixed traditions from different African ethnic groups. Historians like João José Reis highlight that Palmares represented an existential threat to the Portuguese colonial order. Not only did it drain the workforce from the plantations, but it also offered a dangerous example that a free black society was possible. For this reason, it was the target of dozens of military expeditions, resisting all of them for decades, until its final destruction. In Jamaica, the Maroons also waged a relentless guerrilla war against the British. Led by figures like the legendary Queen Nanny, they used their intimate knowledge of the mountainous terrain and their African combat skills to inflict humiliating defeats on the colonial troops. Their resistance was so effective that, in 1739, the British were forced to sign a peace treaty with them, recognizing their autonomy and their lands in exchange for an end to hostilities. These communities were not just refuges, they were centers of cultural preservation. In them, African languages, religious practices, agricultural techniques, and social structures were kept alive, adapted, and passed on to future generations. The Quilombos and Maroon communities were, therefore, more than acts of physical resistance. They were acts of cultural and existential resistance. They proved that it was possible to break the chains and, in the hostile soil of slavery, plant the seeds of a new freedom, watered with the memory of Africa. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the international community began to come to terms with the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. World conferences were organized, debates on reparations gained momentum, and slavery was formally recognized as a crime against humanity. However, amid this clamor for historical justice, a deafening silence hung over the other great slave trade. The history of Arab-Muslim slavery was systematically minimized, ignored, or completely omitted from these global forums, a selective erasure that reveals the complex politics of memory and international solidarity. The most blatant example of this institutional silence occurred at the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, held in Durban, South Africa, in 2001. The event was conceived as a historic moment to confront the legacy of global racism, with the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism at the center of the agenda. However, when some African delegations and NGOs tried to include the issue of the Arab-Muslim trade in the discussion, they met with strong resistance. Representatives from Arab and Muslim countries chose to avoid any debate about their own historical involvement in the slave practice. The French historian Catherine Coquery-Vidrovich observes that this systematic refusal to discuss the Arab trade has roots in an attempt to preserve a positive image of anti-imperialist solidarity with the global South, projecting the blame exclusively onto the West. This deliberate omission is not a new or accidental phenomenon. Tidiane Ndiaye points out that there are deep political and cultural reasons for this erasure. The dominant narrative, both in the West and in many African countries, focused on the European crime, leaving the trade operated by Arab and Islamic nations in a convenient background. The historian Joseph Key-Zerbo argues that this bias created an incomplete view of the reality of slavery, obscuring the complicity and agency of different actors throughout history. For many, the contemporary religious and political solidarity between the Arab and African worlds makes it uncomfortable and politically incorrect to confront a painful past in which one was the oppressor and the other the victim. The result of this policy of forgetting is an immense gap in our understanding of the deep roots of many current ethnic and religious conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. The silence in Durban was not just a diplomatic failure. It was the continuation of a process of historical erasure that denies justice and recognition to millions of victims and perpetuates an open wound, preventing any possibility of genuine reconciliation. The silence about the Arab-Muslim slave trade is not limited to the corridors of international diplomacy. It is deeply rooted in the very way history has been written and taught, both in the West and in the Islamic world. Historiography, the study of the writing of history, is not a neutral process. It is shaped by power relations, political agendas, and cultural prejudices. In the case of African slavery, the dominant narratives were selective, building an almost exclusive focus on the transatlantic trade, while relegating the Oriental trade to an obscure footnote, if not ignoring it completely. In the West, the Eurocentric narrative long dominated historical studies. African slavery was framed primarily within the history of European colonialism and the rise of capitalism. The focus was on the Middle Passage, plantation economies, and European-led abolitionist movements. Although this approach is vital, its exclusivity had the effect of presenting Europe as the only major actor, and eventually a redeemer, in the history of slavery, obscuring the complicity and agency of other empires and cultures. The Arab trade, being a phenomenon that predates and exceeds European involvement in duration, simply did not fit into this convenient and self-centered narrative. To admit its scale and brutality would complicate the story, introducing a non-Western complicity that challenges the simplistic dichotomy of a European oppressor versus a non-European victim. On the other hand, historiography within the Islamic world itself has been equally, if not more, reluctant to confront this past. The historian Bernard Lewis, one of the greatest authorities on the Middle East, observed that there is a persistent tendency in academic studies and popular education in Muslim countries to soften, justify, or simply ignore the history of slavery. The practice is often contextualized as a norm of the time, or justified based on interpretations of religious law that sanctioned it, without a deep self-criticism of its devastating impact. There is an attempt to preserve an idealized image of Islamic civilization as inherently more just and humane than the Christian West, recognizing that this same civilization conducted a brutal slave trade for more than a millennium, with practices such as mass castration, would tarnish this self-image and challenge narratives of fraternity and religious solidarity with Islamic Africa. The result of this convergence of silences, a West focused on its own crime and an East reluctant to confront its own, is a conspiracy of forgetting that leaves the history of the Arab-Muslim trade in a kind of academic limbo. The consequence, as Tidiane Ndiaye points out, is a widespread lack of knowledge that has concrete implications, preventing the understanding of the deep roots of conflicts and prejudices that persist to this day. Amid the generalized silence of academia and diplomacy, the task of rescuing the history of the Arab-Muslim slave trade fell to a small but courageous group of historians. These researchers, often rowing against the tide of political correctness and facing criticism from various sides, dedicated their careers to excavating archives, deciphering records, and giving voice to the millions of silenced victims. Without the meticulous and at times controversial work of figures like the Senegalese Tidiane Ndiaye and the British-American Bernard Lewis, our knowledge about this hidden tragedy would be drastically poorer. Tidiane Ndiaye, an anthropologist and economist by training, became one of the most prominent and forceful voices on the topic. His main work, Le Génocide voilé, The Veiled Genocide, published in 2008, was a watershed moment. Writing from an African perspective, Ndiaye does not hesitate to use the word genocide to describe a system that, through castration and extreme mortality, resulted in the demographic erasure of the descendants of Africans in the Muslim world. He harshly criticizes what he calls amnesia and denial on the part of Arab and Muslim African intellectuals who, for religious solidarity, refuse to confront this painful past. Ndiaye's work is controversial, but its importance lies in his courage to name the crime and to center the narrative on the African experience, challenging both Eurocentric historiography and Islamic apologetics. Bernard Lewis, who passed away in 2018, was a giant in the field of Middle Eastern studies. In works like Race and Slavery in the Middle East, Lewis delved deeply into the legal, literary, and religious texts of the Islamic world to trace the history of slavery and racism. With his unparalleled erudition, he demonstrated how slavery was an institution deeply rooted in classical Islamic society, sanctioned by law and accepted by all layers of the population. Lewis was one of the first Western academics to give the topic due attention, analyzing the religious justifications and racial hierarchies that developed, where Black Africans were often placed in the lowest position. Although his work also generated controversy, especially in relation to his views on contemporary Islam, his pioneering research on slavery provided the academic foundation upon which many later historians built. Alongside other important researchers like Murray Gordon, author of Slavery in the Arab World, and Catherine Kokery-Vidrovich, these essential historians functioned as the critical conscience of the profession, refusing to allow forgetfulness to prevail. They reminded us that history must be told in its entirety, no matter how uncomfortable or politically inconvenient it may be. One of the most complex and disturbing issues surrounding the legacy of the Arab-Muslim slave trade is the relative silence on the subject within Africa itself, especially among Muslim communities and intellectuals. Why does a continent that suffered so much at the hands of Arab slave traders seem so reluctant to confront this part of its history? To explain this phenomenon, the historian Tidiane Ndiaye coined a provocative and controversial phrase, African Stockholm Syndrome. He uses this psychological metaphor to describe a situation in which victims or their descendants develop a kind of solidarity or even admiration for their historical oppressors, a loyalty forged through a shared religious identity. According to Ndiaye, the expansion of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa, which often went hand in hand with the slave trade, created a deep cultural and spiritual bond between many African peoples and the Arab world. Religious identity as a Muslim became, for many, stronger than racial identity, or the historical memory of oppression. This religious solidarity, he argues, led to a form of collective amnesia. Criticizing the historical role of Arabs in slavery came to be seen as an attack on Islam itself, a betrayal of a faith shared by millions of Africans. The Senegalese sociologist Cheikh Anta Diop had already noted this tendency, observing how common religious identity can lead historically victimized groups to minimize or forget the suffering inflicted by aggressors who share the same faith. When religion becomes the main marker of belonging, the slave-owning past of former allies in faith becomes a taboo subject, an inconvenient family secret that is best not mentioned. This selective amnesia manifests itself in several ways. In the school curricula of many Muslim African countries, the transatlantic trade is taught in detail, while the Arab trade is mentioned superficially, if at all. African intellectuals and political leaders who are eloquent in condemning European colonialism are often silent when it comes to Arab imperialism. And Ndiaye argues that this attitude prevents a true reckoning with the past and perpetuates a distorted view of African history. The Stockholm Syndrome theory is, without a doubt, a simplification of a very complex reality, and many critics consider it excessively polemical. Factors such as the complex web of contemporary political and economic alliances also play a crucial role. However, Ndiaye's phrase serves as a powerful catalyst for debate, forcing an uncomfortable reflection on the loyalties that shape historical memory. It forces us to ask, how can a people heal the wounds of their past if they refuse to recognize the identity of all their aggressors? The silence surrounding the Arab-Muslim slave trade places modern African intellectuals, historians, and activists in an extraordinarily difficult and delicate position. They find themselves at the center of a profound dilemma, a conflict between loyalties that seem mutually exclusive, loyalty to their religious and cultural identity, shared with the Arab world, and loyalty to historical truth and the memory of their ancestors who suffered under the oppression of that same world. Navigating this minefield requires immense intellectual courage, as any attempt at a critical analysis of the past runs the risk of being interpreted as an attack on the faith or as an act of alliance with Western critics of Islam. For many Muslim African intellectuals, the Islamic faith is not a foreign religion imposed upon them, but an integral part of their heritage and identity for centuries. Islam brought with it not only spirituality, but also literacy, jurisprudence, and a connection to a global civilization. To openly criticize the role that this same civilization played in the enslavement of their ancestors can seem like an act of self-repudiation, a betrayal of the community of faith, the Ummah. The Nigerian historian Toyin Falola highlights that this dilemma creates real challenges in educating populations about their past. How to teach about the brutality of Arab slave caravans without alienating students from a faith that they consider their own. How to discuss the verses of the Quran that were used to justify slavery without being accused of blasphemy. This tension leads many to adopt an apologetic or minimizing approach. It is argued that the slavery practiced by Muslims was milder than that practiced by Europeans, that slaves could convert and be assimilated, or that slavery was simply a norm of the time. While some of these points may have validity in specific contexts, when used as a comprehensive argument, they serve to overshadow the systemic brutality of the trade, including castration and the razzias of human hunting. The practical result of this dilemma is the perpetuation of a hierarchy of suffering. The white crime of the transatlantic trade is fully recognized, debated, and demands reparations, while the Arab crime remains in the shadows, treated as an embarrassing family matter. This not only distorts history, but also demeans the suffering of millions of Africans whose lives were destroyed by the Oriental trade. The challenge for the modern African intellectual is to find a way to be both a faithful believer and an honest historian, to embrace their religious identity without closing their eyes to the crimes that were committed in its name. It is a search for a narrative that can recognize both the light and the shadow of their own history, a precarious balance that few, so far, have dared to attempt. While Arab and Islamic historiography is often reticent about the details of the slave trade, a substantial body of documentary evidence survives thanks to the accounts of eyewitnesses, many of them European. From the 19th century onwards, British and other explorers, missionaries, and diplomats penetrated the interior of Africa and traveled through the Middle East, and what they saw horrified them. Their diaries, letters, and books, although written from a colonial perspective and often imbued with their own prejudices, provide a graphic and invaluable testimony to the scale and brutality of the Oriental slave trade at its height. Dr. David Livingstone, the famous Scottish missionary and explorer, dedicated the last years of his life to exposing the horrors of the slave trade in East Africa. In his travels through the Great Lakes region, he witnessed firsthand the devastation caused by Arab slave hunters and their local allies. In one of his most famous dispatches, he described a scene of massacre in Nyangwe, in modern-day Congo, where traders opened fire on a crowd in a market, killing hundreds of people to create chaos and capture women and children. He wrote with indignation, "If my revelations about the terrible slave trade in this place do not lead to its suppression, I shall not know where to seek help." His accounts, published in Great Britain, shocked the Victorian public and were one of the main catalysts for the intensification of the British abolitionist campaign in East Africa. Another crucial witness was Sir Richard Burton, an explorer, linguist, and diplomat of a complex and controversial personality. Burton traveled extensively throughout northeastern Africa and the Middle East, often in disguise, and documented his observations in meticulous detail. In his travels, he described the slave markets of cities like Zanzibar and Cairo, detailing the prices, the ethnic origins of the captives, and the uses for which they were intended. He confirmed the immense demand for eunuchs and the extremely lucrative nature of this specific trade. In his work, A Personal Narrative of a Pilgrimage to Al-Madinah and Mecca, he describes slavery as ubiquitous in Arab society. His accounts, although sometimes expressed in language we would now consider racist, are fundamental for their ethnographic precision. They provide an inside view of the system, confirming the scale of the trade and the normalization of slavery in the daily life of the Middle East. Together, the accounts of men like Livingstone, Burton, and others, such as the German explorer Gustav Nachtigall, form a body of irrefutable documentary evidence. They are the voices that broke the silence, recording for posterity a suffering that, otherwise, might have been completely erased from historical memory. The practice of castration, the central gear of the invisible genocide, was not just an act of brutality, but also a highly specialized and terrifyingly lucrative industry. The economic logic behind the eunuch trade is a terrible example of how market demand can lead to extreme levels of dehumanization. Despite the prohibitively high mortality rates associated with the procedure, the price a surviving eunuch fetched in the markets of the Ottoman Empire or Persia was so exorbitant that it compensated for the losses, turning the mutilation of children into a viable and coveted commercial enterprise. The production of eunuchs occurred in specialized centers, located strategically along the slave routes. Coptic monasteries in Upper Egypt, such as that of Abu Ghurg, were notorious for this practice, as were other locations in the Darfur region and North Africa. Young boys, usually between 7 and 10 years old, were the targets, as it was believed they had a better chance of surviving the operation. The procedure itself, known as total emasculation, involved the removal of all external genital organs. It was performed crudely, with unsterilized knives or razors, and without any form of anesthesia. After the mutilation, the boy was buried up to his neck in hot sand for several days, a primitive technique aimed at stopping the bleeding and allowing urine to drain through a cannula inserted into the urethra. The chances of survival were minimal. Death from hemorrhage, shock, or infection, tetanus, gangrene, was the norm. As already mentioned, mortality estimates range from 70% to 80%, a staggering number that reveals how disposable the lives of these children were. However, for the merchants, this macabre equation made financial sense. If they bought, for example, 10 boys for a low price in the interior of Africa, and 8 died during the castration process, the 2 survivors would be worth many times more than the total initial investment. A eunuch was a luxury item, a rare and precious good. Accounts from the 19th century, such as those of Richard Burton, confirmed that a eunuch could be sold for a price 10 times higher than that of an uncastrated slave. They were status symbols for the elite, and the possession of eunuchs was a demonstration of immense wealth and power. This perverse economic logic created a vicious cycle. High demand and high prices encouraged merchants to submit more and more children to the procedure, even knowing that the vast majority would die in the process. The economy of castration is perhaps the most extreme example of the commodification of human beings. It transformed a child's body into a raw material to be processed, where mutilation added value, and death was simply calculated as an operational cost in the pursuit of extraordinary profit. In the opulent palaces of Baghdad, Cairo, and Istanbul, a ruler's power was not just measured by the size of their armies or the vastness of their empire, but also by the magnificence of their court. And within that court, 2 interconnected institutions served as the ultimate demonstration of status, wealth, and authority: the harem and the body of eunuchs who guarded it. The harem, with its hundreds or even thousands of women, and the eunuchs, with their loyalty guaranteed by the knife, were not just elements of the sovereign's domestic life. They were political instruments and visible symbols of their absolute power over the lives and bodies of their subjects. The harem, from the Arabic harem, meaning forbidden place or sanctuary, was the private and inviolable section of the palace, where the wives, concubines, children, and female relatives of the ruler resided. Its scale could be prodigious. The harem of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mutawakkil in the 9th century supposedly housed 4,000 concubines. In the Ottoman palaces, the imperial harem was a complex institution with its own rigid hierarchy, administered by the sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan. The primary function of the harem was to ensure the continuity of the dynasty by producing heirs. However, it also served as a symbol of the sultan's global power. The women of the harem came from all parts of the empire and beyond, many of them captured in wars or bought as slaves. They represented the diversity of the ruler's dominion and his ability to command the beauty and loyalty of different peoples. Possessing a vast harem was a demonstration of virility and unlimited resources. However, an institution like the harem presented a fundamental problem: how to ensure security and order in a space full of women, and, more importantly, how to ensure that any child born there was, without a shadow of a doubt, the sovereign's. The solution was the eunuch. Castrated men were the ideal servants for this environment. Incapable of procreating, they posed no threat to the royal bloodline. Their loyalty was, therefore, considered absolute, as they could not have ambitions to found their own dynasty. They were the intermediaries between the male world of public power and the female world of the harem. They controlled access, managed finances, educated the royal children, and served as trusted confidants. The eunuchs were divided into two categories: white eunuchs, usually from the Balkans or the Caucasus, who served in administrative functions outside the harem, and black eunuchs, almost exclusively from sub-Saharan Africa, who were the direct guardians of the private quarters. The chief of the black eunuchs, Kislar Aga in the Ottoman Empire, became one of the most powerful figures in the state, controlling vast properties and wielding immense political influence. The presence of eunuchs was, therefore, the guarantee of dynastic order and a visible symbol of the ruler's supremacy, who could reshape the very nature of his servants to suit his needs. The harem and the eunuch were thus two sides of the same coin of absolute power, a coin forged in sexual exploitation and physical mutilation. From the late 18th century, a new and powerful moral force began to sweep the Atlantic world: abolitionism. Driven by Enlightenment principles, the religious fervor of groups like the Quakers, and, crucially, by shocking accounts of the realities of slavery, a massive transnational movement arose to demand an end to the slave trade, and eventually, to the institution of slavery itself. This campaign of moral conscience, which mobilized public opinion, petitions, and political actions, was fundamental to the end of the transatlantic trade in the 19th century. In stark contrast, the Arab-Muslim world, where slavery was equally, if not more, entrenched, did not see the emergence of a comparable internal abolitionist movement. Abolition in the Middle East, when it finally occurred, was largely the result of external pressures, not an internal moral awakening. The abolitionist movement in the West was multifaceted. Intellectuals like Adam Smith argued that free labor was economically more efficient. Religious figures like William Wilberforce in Great Britain framed slavery as a mortal sin, and former slaves like Olaudah Equiano published powerful narratives that exposed the brutality of the system to a shocked public. The movement used every tool available: boycotts of products like slave-produced sugar, pamphlets, public rallies, and parliamentary lobbying. The British Royal Navy was even mobilized to patrol the coast of Africa and intercept slave ships. This combined effort, which lasted for decades, gradually changed public opinion and forced governments to act, culminating in the prohibition of the slave trade by Great Britain and the United States in 1807, and the gradual abolition of slavery in their colonies in the following decades. In the Arab-Muslim world, however, the scenario was completely different. Slavery was deeply sanctioned by tradition and by the interpretation of religious law. As we have seen, it was not seen as a sin to be eradicated, but as an institution regulated by God. Consequently, there was no internal theological or philosophical basis for an abolitionist movement. No figures equivalent to Wilberforce or Equiano emerged. To criticize slavery was, in essence, to criticize Sharia itself, an unthinkable act for most Muslim scholars and jurists of the time. The slave trade was not a subject of public debate or moral crisis. It was simply an accepted part of the social order. The pressure for abolition, when it came from outside, mainly from Great Britain. From the mid-19th century, British naval and diplomatic power began to pressure the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and the Sultanates of Arabia and Zanzibar to prohibit the trade. These abolition decrees were often reluctantly signed under duress and were difficult to enforce in practice, encountering local resistance. This fundamental contrast reveals a deep difference in the trajectories of the two civilizations. While the West developed, from its own internal contradictions, a moral movement that challenged and eventually overthrew the institution of slavery, the Islamic world maintained the practice until it was forced to abandon it by an external power. The abolition of the slave trade and slavery in the Arab Muslim world was not a single event, but a long, fragmented, and often reluctant process that extended from the 19th century well into the 20th. Unlike the abolitionist movement in the West, which was driven by a strong internal moral current, the end of slavery in the East was largely precipitated by growing European hegemony and the relentless diplomatic and military pressure of Great Britain. Although some internal reformist voices emerged, the driving force for change was, undeniably, external. From the 1840s onwards, Great Britain, having abolished slavery in its own empire and now leading a global crusade against the trade, turned its attention to the Ottoman Empire and other Muslim powers. Using its naval power to control sea routes and its diplomatic influence, the British began to pressure the Ottoman Sultan to take measures. The first major success came in 1847, when the Sultan agreed to prohibit the import of African slaves by sea to his ports in the Persian Gulf. In 1857, a more comprehensive decree prohibited the trade of black slaves throughout the empire, with the exception of the Hejaz province, where the holy cities of Mecca and Medina are located, a concession to religious sensitivity. In practice, however, these decrees were poorly enforced. The trade continued clandestinely, and the institution of slavery itself remained legal. British pressure was particularly intense on Zanzibar, the epicenter of the East African trade. In 1873, the British consul John Kirk, a former companion of Livingstone, presented an ultimatum to Sultan Bargash bin Said. Either he closed the Zanzibar slave market, or the British Navy would blockade and bombard the island. Under this direct threat, the Sultan ceded, signing a treaty that officially closed the great slave market and prohibited maritime trade in the region. This was a significant blow, but the trade simply moved to the interior and to land routes. In Egypt, which was increasingly under British and French control, slavery was formally abolished in 1877. However, in more remote and independent areas, such as the Arabian Peninsula, the practice persisted openly for much longer. Saudi Arabia, for example, only officially abolished slavery in 1962, and Mauritania, in West Africa, was the last country in the world to do so in 1981, although the practice persists to this day. The official end of slavery in the Muslim world was, therefore, a process imposed from top to bottom and from outside in, a forced modernization that was often not accompanied by a profound change in social and racial attitudes, which helps to explain why the legacies of slavery, such as anti-black racism, remain so present in many parts of the region to this day. While the practice of castration largely explains the absence of a visible and cohesive black diaspora in the Middle East, it does not tell the whole story. Millions of African slaves who were transported to the region were not castrated. This includes the overwhelming majority of women, destined for harems and domestic service, and a significant number of men used as soldiers, agricultural workers, and in other roles. What happened to their descendants? This question leads us to the territory of a hidden genetic legacy, a history of silent assimilation and absorption that, although less dramatic than annihilation by castration, also contributed to the disappearance of African identity. This is a complex area of study, often based more on anthropological speculation and emerging genetic evidence than on clear historical records. The key to understanding this silent absorption is, again, in the harem system and Islamic law on descent. As mentioned, the children of a free Muslim man with his enslaved concubine were born free and were legally recognized as his heirs. Unlike the rigid one-drop rules that evolved in the Americas, where any trace of African ancestry made a person black, Middle Eastern society had a more fluid racial classification system. The children of mixed unions were often assimilated into their father's culture and ethnicity. Over a few generations, through continuous marriages with the local population, African physical traits could be diluted, and the memory of slave ancestry was often forgotten or deliberately suppressed, as it carried a social stigma. This process of assimilation can be seen today in the phenotypes of many populations in the Middle East and North Africa. It is not uncommon to find people in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Egypt, and even Iran and Iraq with physical traits, such as darker skin, curly hair, or facial features, that indicate sub-Saharan African ancestry. However, these people identify and are identified as Arabs, Persians, or another local ethnicity, and the connection to Africa was lost in the mists of time. More visible communities such as the Afro-Iranians in southern Iran or the Akdam in Yemen, who have maintained a more distinct identity, are often marginalized and occupy the lowest rungs of society, a reminder of the persistent racial stigma. Recent genetic studies are beginning to confirm this history. DNA research in Middle Eastern populations often reveals a significant percentage of haplogroups of sub-Saharan African origin, a silent testimony in the genetic code of a forced migration that written history has often ignored. The legacy of the Arab trade is, therefore, not just a story of absence, but also a story of a hidden presence, of an African ancestry invisibly woven into the genetic tapestry of the Middle East itself. Although slavery has been officially abolished in all countries of the world, the practice persists in modern forms, such as forced labor and human trafficking. However, in some corners of the world, traditional slavery, based on ancestry and the ownership of one person by another, continues to exist, a sinister shadow of the past that refuses to die. Nowhere is this more evident than in Mauritania, a West African country located at the crossroads of the Arab world and sub-Saharan Africa. The persistence of slavery in Mauritania and the resurgence of slave markets in war-torn Libya are not new phenomena. They are the direct continuation of the racial structures and ideologies established during the centuries of the Trans-Saharan slave trade. Mauritania was the last country in the world to abolish slavery in 1981, and only criminalized it in 2007 under international pressure. Despite this, the practice continues to affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Mauritanian society is rigidly stratified by race and ancestry. At the top are the white Moors of Arab Berber descent. Below them are the Haratin, or black Moors, descendants of slaves who speak Arabic, and at the bottom are the Afro-Mauritanians, who speak other African languages. The Haratin are the main enslaved population. For generations, they have been the property of the white Moors, living as domestic servants, herders, and rural workers. Children are born into slavery, belonging to their mother's master. Although many Haratin are technically free today, they live in a caste system that denies them education, economic opportunities, and political representation, perpetuating a cycle of servitude. The justification for this practice is rooted in an interpretation of Islamic law and a racist ideology that sees black people as naturally servile, a direct echo of the Arab trade mentality. More recently, the collapse of the state in Libya after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 created a power vacuum that allowed for the resurgence of barbaric practices. Libya has become a crucial transit point for migrants and refugees from sub-Saharan Africa trying to reach Europe. Militias and criminal groups exploit the vulnerability of these migrants, capturing them and selling them in open slave markets. Shocking reports from 2017 showed auctions where black men were sold for a few $100s for forced labor. This modern horror is occurring in the same cities that were once important depots in the Trans-Saharan trade. The dehumanization and racialization of black migrants by Libyan traffickers, treating them as commodities without rights, did not come out of nowhere. They are based on a deep anti-black prejudice that has historical roots in the region, a toxic legacy of the time when slave caravans were a common sight in the desert. The cases of Mauritania and Libya are grim reminders that legal abolition is not enough to eradicate a practice so deeply rooted in culture and economy. As long as the racist ideologies that sustain the trade are not confronted, slavery will continue to find new and terrible ways to survive. In recent decades, the movement for reparations for the transatlantic slave trade has gained significant momentum. Organizations, activists, and Caribbean nations have demanded that the former European colonial powers and the United States recognize their historical responsibility and provide financial, educational, and cultural compensation for the crime of slavery and its lasting legacy of racial inequality and underdevelopment. This debate, however controversial it may be, is firmly on the international agenda. However, when it comes to the Arab-Muslim trade, the conversation about reparations and recognition is practically non-existent. There is a notable silence on the part of Arab and Middle Eastern countries about their historical responsibility, and almost no international pressure for them to confront their slave-owning past. The absence of this debate can be attributed to several factors we have already explored. The demographic erasure of the victims, due to castration and assimilation, means that there is no large and politically organized black diaspora in the Middle East to demand justice, as there is in the Americas. The silence of many African governments and intellectuals, often due to religious or political solidarity, also weakens any potential demand for reparations. Furthermore, the dominant narrative that exclusively blames the West for global underdevelopment makes it politically inconvenient to point the finger at other regions of the global South. The result is a blatant double standard. While European countries are, correctly, pressured to apologize and consider reparations, Middle Eastern countries, many of which became immensely wealthy from oil, escape any scrutiny about the wealth their own nations accumulated through centuries of human trafficking. To date, there has been no official apology from a head of state of an Arab or Muslim country for their nation's role in the African slave trade. There are no museums in cities like Cairo, Istanbul, or Muscat that document and confront this history in the same way that slavery museums do in Liverpool or Washington, D.C. There are no educational programs that teach children about the brutality of the razzias or the reality of harems and the eunuch trade. For historians like Tidiane Ndiaye, this lack of recognition is not just a historical injustice, but an obstacle to full reconciliation and mutual respect. He argues that a true dialogue and partnership between Africa and the Arab world can only be built on the foundation of truth, which requires an honest recognition of the crimes of the past. While the transatlantic trade is increasingly recognized as a crime against humanity that requires reparations, the Arab-Muslim trade remains largely a crime without confession, without remorse, and without reparations, perpetuating the invisibility of its millions of victims. The gradual end of the mass slave trade, driven by British abolitionist pressure, and the growing European colonial domination in Africa during the late 19th century, did not bring an immediate era of peace and prosperity. Instead, it triggered a period of profound economic upheaval and political reconfiguration. For the states and economies that had become entirely dependent on the trade in human beings, abolition was a cataclysm that led to collapse and opened the way for new forms of exploitation. The post-journey scenario was not the end of suffering, but the transformation of one system of oppression into another. Zanzibar is the clearest example of this collapse. At the height of its power, in the 1860s, the island was the center of a commercial empire whose main export was ivory and slaves. The Omani Arab elite that ruled the island and the Swahili coast owed its immense wealth to this predatory economy. When the treaties imposed by the British closed the slave market in 1873 and gradually strangled the trade, the economic base of the Sultanate of Zanzibar collapsed. The island's vast clove plantations, which also relied on slave labor, went into crisis. Unable to sustain itself and militarily weakened, the Sultanate became an easy target for British imperial ambitions, becoming a British protectorate in 1890. Abolition in this case served as a prelude to formal colonization. The Arab elite lost its autonomous power, and the African population, although technically free, went from being enslaved by the Arabs to subjugated by the British. The racial tensions planted during the era of slavery did not disappear. They fermented under colonial rule and exploded violently in the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964, when the African majority overthrew the Sultan and massacred thousands of Arabs and Indians, an act of historical revenge for the legacy of slavery. In the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, the end of the Trans-Saharan trade also destabilized the kingdoms and groups that controlled it. Warlords like Rabia Zubair and leaders of slave-trading states saw their power erode as European powers, France, Great Britain, and Italy, imposed their control over the region, using the fight against slavery as one of their main justifications for colonial conquest. In the Middle East, the end of the mass importation of slaves forced social changes. The Ottoman Empire, in its last days, tried to modernize along European lines, and the abolition of slavery was part of that project. However, the legacy persisted. Social and racial hierarchies remained, and discrimination against people of African descent continued. The final collapse of the trade did not lead to a reckoning or a coming to terms with the past, but to a convenient forgetting. The power structures changed, empires fell, and new nations emerged. But the memory of the millions of Africans whose lives were consumed by more than 1,000 years of trade was left behind, buried under the sands of a new political era that had little interest in confronting the ghosts of its past.